Welcome to Your Grey Matters, the podcast that unveils the miracles already amongst us. Here, we believe that the human mind cannot be defeated. Tune in to discover the fascinating people with extraordinary stories, innovative products, and groundbreaking services. With your host, Neil Silvert, who's earned his gray hair and still has use of his gray matter.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Your Grey Matters podcast, and happy Canada Day weekend. How lucky are we to be in this great country? I'm Neil Silvert, your Grey host of the Your Grey Matters podcast. We are really honored today. We're really pleased. We're excited because for a Canada Day weekend special, we have the honor of having a guest, Dan Muys, Conservative MP for Flamborough-Glanbrook-Brant North. Hi, Dan. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Neil. Great to be here, and happy Canada Day to everyone.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. I went out and I bought a new Canada Day shirt, but it's not showing, so I had to show it off here. $5 at a local dollar store. Okay, let me tell you about Dan Muys, a gentleman who actually I've known for many, many years. I've had the privilege of knowing Dan. I've had the privilege of volunteering. I was very lucky to play a role on his staff for a few months as Dan taught me the way of the life of an MP and staff. And just let me give a shout out to Dan's staff. Ladies and gentlemen, if I don't say it during this podcast, you are getting your money's worth when it comes to the cost of MPs and their staffs. These people work nonstop. It is not the summer holidays. It is the summer workload. They're just doing it from home. So when you meet someone who's on an MP staff or an MP, just know you are getting your money's worth. My words, not Dan Muys. So let me tell you about Dan. Dan has served the people of Flamborough-Glanbrook, rural Ancaster, rural Dundas, and rural Upper Stony Creek as their common sense member of parliament since 2021. He is the Conservative Opposition Associate Shadow Minister for Transport, serving on the Transportation, Infrastructure and Communities Committee of Parliament. I should also say he's also the new MP for Brant North, and that's quite exciting. Prior to seeking office, Dan had 25 years in a private sector position in the energy and agri-food sectors. This included working on LNG pipeline proposals, launching North American brands, and promoting Canadian agri-food innovations. At various points in Dan's career, Dan actually lived and worked in Alberta, Ontario, Quebec, and it worked across the United States and was based out of Raleigh, North Carolina. Dan's very experienced. Dan's a Rotarian. Dan is a member of the local chambers of commerce, Coketown Church he attends, and served on the Royal Botanical Gardens Board of Directors prior to being elected to Parliament. Dan and his wife, Tracy, live near Lyndon, Ontario, with their two extremely energetic and beautiful terriers, Allie and Danny. That's coming for a guy who's scared of dogs, but I love Allie and Danny. My experience was amazing working for Dan as an MP. I also was a volunteer. I just felt at my age that it was important to get involved in the process a little more. Nobody else has to do that. Luckily, Dan needed someone, and we worked out an agreement. I learned what work is. I learned what being honored is every day, working on behalf of the people of Canada. And let me just say it again. People in these positions work. Dan, let me set the tone for this episode today. I really want to talk about our country of Canada. We have a great history. We are here now for so many years, since 1867, and really before. But today, Dan, I want to ask you, you're in Parliament, is parliamentary procedure relevant today? And how so?
I would agree. We have the best country in the world. We're not perfect, but we really do have it all here. We have smart people, good people. We're blessed with so many natural resources. And, I like to paraphrase a line from Bill Clinton's 1992 presidential inaugural address and say, we can fix what's wrong with Canada by what's right with Canada. And so I'm very optimistic about Canada and our future and what we have here and our good people. But your question was about the parliamentary system, and we, of course, have the British parliamentary system, which came to us in Confederation with the founding of our country. And it's a system that has evolved over time, and certainly it did in Britain with the transition of power from the king to the people. And in Canada, we've evolved with that tradition as well, and it's got its own set of checks and balances. Us in the opposition can propose motions and changes and amendments and make things better. And with some of the reforms that were made by my colleague Michael Chong with the Democratic Reform Act back in the mid 2010s, there is much more power for individual MPs to have a say. So we do have a process that does allow that democratic input. And, it was Winston Churchill that used to say that democracy is sometimes messy, sometimes the worst form of government, except for all the rest. And I think that holds true today.
And it is true. And our parliamentary procedure, to me, is the basis of life in our whole country, actually. It's what keeps us a democracy in our form, in the British form. And I have to touch on the Senate for a minute. Dan, we're doing a history lesson here today. The Senate. Who are they? I don't mean individual, but who they are as a body, and what do they do, and why are they important to the whole process?
So again, we follow the British system in the sense that there's the House of Commons, which Britain has as well, which is the representatives by population of the people. And then the Senate is meant to be the chamber of sober second thought. And in Britain, it's called the House of Lords. Here, it's senators that are appointed by the Prime Minister of the day, and they're distributed on a provincial basis. And so they take a piece of legislation that's been passed by the House of Commons and review it, give it some thought. The intention is not that the Senate stops the democratic will of the people through the House of Commons, but perhaps sometimes we'll make some changes. So again, there's that system of checks and balances.
So it really is that sober second thought, I think, that is terrific, because then you have hardworking MPs eventually passing bills or not passing bills, but once they do, it's not finished yet. The Senate has to review it, perhaps change it, send it back to Parliament for more discussion. I think it's a very great safety system that's been working for a long time. Lots of politics, I think, in the Senate as much as there is in Parliament, but somehow we seem to make it work.
We do. And that's very Canadian too, as we look to Canada today. We're a very collaborative people, friendly people, and I don't think we'd want it any way else.
I agree. So, Dan, our Canada has a long and amazing history of achievement. There's no question about it. And we're studied as a great country and how we've affected the world in the past. Let me ask you, Dan, are we relevant today to the world? And if so, how?
Absolutely. Canada has an important place in the world, and we always have. At the end of the Second World War, we had the fourth largest navy in the world. And we played an instrumental role in the victory in World War I, doing all the heavy lifting at Vimy Ridge. And in World War II, we were instrumental as well. Obviously, as a Canadian of Dutch heritage, we have a strong association because it was Canadian troops that liberated the Netherlands at the end of the Second World War, but also as the Canadians that worked our way up through Italy in the Second World War. We have had a role to play, and we still do. And we are a country right now, and of course, right now everyone knows we're dealing with trade issues, Trump's tariffs, and that's changing the economic equilibrium of the world, impacting the world. But here in Canada, we have literally everything that the world needs and the world wants, and that's our ace card, and that's where we have a role to play. I mean, we have the third largest reserves of oil, the fifth largest reserves of natural gas. Critical minerals. In fact, 6% of the world's lithium, which you need for foam batteries and technology and defense. The second largest nuclear plant in the world at Bruce Power, and we've been leaders in that technology. Smart people that have developed those innovations. We got potash, uranium, 9% of the world's forests and most of the fresh water. So we do have it all here. We're very blessed, but we're blessed with smart and talented people with ambition. And now's the critical time when we need to build Canada, build nation building projects so that we can unleash that potential. Because as you said, people came to Canada for a reason. They came, as my Omas and Opas did, from the Netherlands after the Second World War when things had been devastated there. And whether you came then or 10 years ago or 15 years ago or 100 years ago or wherever in the world you came from, you came in search of opportunity and freedom, often from persecution and various issues, and hope. So hope, opportunity, and freedom, that is the beacon of Canada. And that is why, people like myself and MPs from all parties and others that get involved in the political process, that's what drives us, is that we want to build a country that people can be proud of, that people seek that hope and opportunity and freedom. And it's one of the reasons why, certainly in the last few years, it's why I left my 25-year career in the private sector to run for office, is because some of that's been slipping away, that middle class dream of Canada. When my grandparents came from the Netherlands with nothing but a suitcase and maybe the clothes in their back, and that's the typical immigrant story. You could come here, you could work hard, you saved up, you bought a home, you started a family, and you could succeed. And that middle class dream was possible. And if we look back 15 years ago, in 2015, the average mortgage on the average home in Canada was $1,432. It's now over $3,500. The average rent was $973. It's now $2,100 or more, depending on which city you're looking at. And so young people have given up on that dream, that promise that Canada gave to people. And so we need to restore that. And that's really what drives us, because we have everything to work with. We should absolutely be booming in this country with opportunity for all, and that hope and that freedom and the values that unite us. We got some work to do. So as I said at the outset, we're the best country on earth, but we're not perfect and there's work to do.
I agree, but I'd like to drill down now a little bit more because, and let's put a little bit of a serious spin on this. I'm a senior, I have kids, I have grandkids, and I've seen a lot of changes in this country. And to be very blunt, I've seen a lot of changes since 2015, and they're concerning. And recently I saw something with our new Prime Minister, Mr. Mark Carney, and there's something I don't understand, I don't like. We just spent the last few minutes talking about parliamentary procedure, the Senate, our history, our relevance to the world, and a welcoming of people because people want to be here. So with all that process, what's an executive order? Because I kind of get the sense, and you don't have to agree with me, that our present Prime Minister is interested in running this country without parliamentary procedure, but with executive order. And I'm wondering if you'd comment on that.
Yeah, so I don't think that executive order exists in the Canadian parliamentary system the way it does, as people are seeing on television with the US, with the president. Ultimately, in order to spend taxpayers' money, to raise money through taxes, to change laws, it does need to go through parliaments. The Prime Minister and the cabinet, whether if we go back to 1867, have always set a direction, but ultimately that does need to go through the parliament, and that's part of our process in our system.
And of course that's true, but I've had some people raise concerns with me that perhaps the government party isn't doing things or possibly isn't doing things by parliamentary process, and I'm not aware of whether they are, they aren't.
Yeah, so I would note a few things. And look, at us in the Conservative opposition are intent on making Canada the best it can be. That is our job. And so there's times when we're going to agree with the government, and there's times when we're going to disagree with the government, but we need to do so constructively. And I think if you look at the last parliamentary session or the last month when Parliament has sat since the election, we've been very constructive in improving legislation and agreeing with ideas that make sense. In fact, a lot of the ideas that the Carney government Liberal government is moving forward with, in fact, were ideas from the Conservative platform. The scrapping of the carbon tax, They have had a tax cut. Doesn't go far enough in our view, but it's a step in the right direction. I'll talk about building projects in free trade within Canada. Same thing as a step in the right direction. So yes, good ideas, and we encourage that. And our leader has said that, Pierre Poilievre. Look, if we've got good ideas and you steal them and implement them, we will applaud that, because those are good ideas that are good for Canadians. They're going to help address the issues of cost of living and crime on our streets, which are the two top issues that we've heard for years, and we've heard day in and day out on the campaign trail. But the other thing, and maybe that's a little bit where you're getting at, is they haven't presented a budget. So here we have a prime minister who claimed to be the man with a plan. We haven't seen the plan yet, because a budget is a plan. And if you're a single mother, and if you're a small business, frankly, if you're any household, you have a budget. You have to run your household by a budget. And so we haven't seen that. They decided not to do a budget in the spring, which is highly unusual, and instead ran through almost $500 billion in spending estimates. We oppose those. The other parties agreed to them because we want to see the budget. So let's see the budget. They say it's going to come in the fall. We'll reserve judgment until we see that. But to me, that's not off to a good start. Where is the plan? And if there was any time in our history, given the economic headwinds that we're facing, we need a plan. And it's great to have these pieces. And I guess that would be the other criticism. There's certainly announcements of pieces of legislation. There's signals. There's a lot of circumstance and pomp around the king giving a throne speech, the premiers meeting, the G7 summit, the NATO summit, etc. And that's all good. But how does that tie together? And how is that going to bring affordability to the average Canadian, which we've said the middle class's dream is slipping away? How is that addressing housing affordability? There was a report out from Royal LePage last week that said that 39% of people who rent were cutting back on food and essentials just to meet the rent payments. And further, 22% of them were relying on credit cards, just in a cycle of credit cards to make ends meet. So the housing plan isn't working. We're not seeing housing affordability. We're not seeing houses built. In fact, the CMHC has given up on the targets. So that these are all concerns. And while the Carney government has only been in for a month or so, there's already some concerns from that perspective for sure. And we definitely want to see what's in the budget and how does that add up, and what's that going to cost Canadians?
Exactly. And Dan, we've recently, in the last week or so, been following, and if you're following it in the news, ladies and gentlemen, this will register with you. But Dan, I'd like you to talk a little bit about Bill C-5. Perhaps explain what it is. And ladies and gentlemen, I've asked Dan to talk about it today because it is in the news. It is an important bill. It has passed. The Conservatives did support it with amendments. But Dan and a number of people were on a committee that were studying and eventually passing amendments. And correct me if words are not right, Dan, but you were on a committee with like Philip Lawrence, Conservative Shadow Minister for Intergovernmental Affairs and One Canadian Economy, Interprovincial Trade. You had Shannon Stubbs, who's a Conservative Shadow Minister for Energy and Natural Resources, and a lot of other good people interested in the health and welfare of our country. And yet, it seems to me, and it might only be me, Dan, I'm ready to be corrected, the kinds of changes that you had to make were that changes where I felt that the Liberals are trying to circumvent things like Access to the Information Act, the Lobbying Act, Canada Elections Act, Criminal Code, and on and on and on. And maybe that's what I was trying to say before. Is this a government that was trying to hide things that, in my opinion, could have hurt our country and our process by hiding them in a bill?
So first of all, let me agree with you and give a shout out to my colleagues on the Transportation Committee: Philip Lawrence, Shannon Stubbs, Dan Albus, Leslie Lewis was on the committee, and others that subbed in and provided support throughout the process, because the Transport Committee looked at Bill C-5. Every bill once it gets past second reading in the House of Commons, goes to a committee for study before it goes back to the House of Commons for the final sets of votes that pass it into legislation from the House's perspective before it goes to the Senate. And so it came to the Transport Committee, and we had a lot of work. So it was a very busy week last week as we looked at C-5. So what C-5 was the Liberal bill that had kind of two parts to it. One was to talk about one Canadian economy. So in other words, free trade within Canada. The other part was about building national or major projects in Canada. So let me parse that out a little bit, because we did close a lot of loopholes and make some amendments to legislation to make it much better, much more transparent, much more accountable, ensure there were some guardrails that weren't in the original legislation as drafted. And I'll explain why that matters. But if we back up a little bit, okay, obviously, free trade in Canada is an important, and we talked about it that in the election campaign. There's $200 billion of money of our economy that's left on the table because of trade barriers. And the last time that the Liberals introduced free trade within Canada, well, there were so many pages of exceptions, it really didn't move the needle at all. So with Bill C-5, they've introduced, we would call this a baby step towards free trade within Canada. Are we going to have free trade within Canada by Canada Day, as they promised? No. But it's a step forward. The other part to this was building major projects. And we've said that, as I said earlier, we have all these resources and a wealth of them. And it's important that we utilize that to diversify our economy. So right now, we're 77% dependent upon the U.S. for trade. And obviously, given the new administration in the U.S., that's not where we want to be, and nor is it even prudent to put all our eggs in one basket. And so, when the Trudeau government said no to Germany, it said no to Japan, and 7, 8 other countries that wanted our liquefied natural gas, that was an opportunity to diversify our economy. And so we said it. Well, look, we've got all these resources. There's every reason that Canada should be booming. We should be fueling Europe right now. We should be fueling Asia. We've got all the critical minerals that are needed. We've got reliable energy supply to attract data centers, AI centers, good paying jobs. We're experts in nuclear. So yes, we are the party of building. We've been advocating that for years, building major projects. What the Liberals proposed, the Carney government just proposed with C-5, they're going to look at approving that, major nation building projects. Well, I guess what we'd say is, look, you have built up all of these impediments to building these projects over the course of the last 10 years. Bill C-69, which is the Anti-Pipeline, Anti-Development Act, C, which is the shipping ban, the oil and gas production cap, the industrial carbon tax. So we've put in all these impediments to actually doing things we need to make our country grow and prosper and build these projects. And yet you've proposed now this other bill that's just going to do this little work around that instead of actually addressing the root cause, which is these impediments, because we have it all and we should be booming, and we don't need an act of parliament to tell us that we should be building nation building projects. The private sector and smart, good people will do that if not faced with these impediments. So when they came forward with this bill C-5, the problem when it was originally drafted is it allowed the federal cabinet to circumvent any law on the books federally. So that's a whole lot of power. And are the decisions on these multi-billion-dollar projects going to be made behind closed doors? If you are a person with business interests or investment interests, are you a party to approving projects that your investment portfolios may benefit from? So there were clearly some significant problems with that. And so we, together with opposition colleagues, were able to insert amendments that said, okay, look, here's 15 different pieces of legislation plus that you can't circumvent, including the Lobbying Act and the ethics legislation and the various pieces of transparency legislation, the Criminal Code, the Conflict of Interest Act, et cetera, so that there was that safeguard and those guardrails. And also that the project that's being proposed to be approved needs to come to Parliament for review, and the consultation process needs to be reported upon, and the criteria for that needs to be presented to Parliament. And so there's at least some oversight as to what that is. And it's not just a decision made behind closed doors. and not this blank check. So yes, we are the party of building. We want to see this building happen. We agreed with the legislation. We made some amendments so that it had some safeguards for transparency, accountability, and frankly, actually getting some stuff done. But we still say, if you would actually get rid of the things that are stopping and holding Canada's economy back, we'd be further ahead. So we made some progress, but not enough in our view. And so now we'll see, where does that go.
And I guess, and I used the wrong words, I admit it, executive order. But it is what I was trying to refer to is when I read an article that we're going to actually give a link to with this podcast that talks about how the Conservatives closed some Liberal loopholes. I was referring to the fact that they would even try to do this. And I know that everybody has large bills and has tried to put stuff through omnibus bills. But I found these, ladies and gentlemen, I may be the only person on this planet who feels this way. This isn't necessarily the way MP Dan Muys feels. But I was astounded, in my opinion, about the heinousness of what they were trying to put through quietly. And it shocked me because I go back to my original question was, and I'll change it a bit, is parliamentary procedure actually relevant to the present government? You don't have to answer that. But that was the alarm and the sirens that went off in my head. And after reading the article, I was stunned, Dan. That does concern me. And it is part of what I wanted to raise today because our country is built on a procedure. And I don't believe that anybody is elected any government to change these procedures and hide things. And yet, here we almost had it, or we could have had it.
Well, and that's why we made changes. We asked these questions of witnesses at committee before we proposed various amendments, and we heard from the deputy clerk of the Privy Council who said that they're working with the Prime Minister's office on conflicts and interests that they may have. And look, I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt because I wouldn't want to cause dispersions. But I'm certainly glad that my colleagues were putting forward these amendments, that we worked together in committee and that we passed those through because that closed a lot of those loopholes and introduced some safeguards. I mean, one of the other things is that they can't exercise these powers when Parliament is prorogued or dissolved. It's not, there's a number of loopholes that were closed that really, but again, to raise it back up to the 30,000 foot level, what about getting rid of the legislation that's stopping pipelines from being built? That's stopping oil from being shipped off the BC coast. That's stopping, the production that's going to lead to our prosperity. Because the problem right now with our gas is that we're landlocked, and so we sell our oil at at a discount to the United States, 80 to 85% of market value. So that's $50 million a day left on the table because we can't get our resources to Tidewater. So we need more LNG pipes and facilities to export that to the countries that want it. And same on the Atlantic coast to get to Europe, who want it. Germany wanted it. In fact, when Trudeau said no to Germany, Germany went to Qatar, who built them the LNG import facility in somewhere around 270 days. And this is Germany. This is not an environmental backwater by any stretch. And now Qatar not only got the business, but Qatar also is a state sponsor of terror. So, what are we doing for the world in that sense? And one of the things we can do for the world when we talk about Canada's place in the world is provide energy security. That's one of the things we do for global security. We have that ability in Canada. And, Germany, have they not been able to get, and they're going to need more liquefied natural gas and other sources of energy because they want to cut their dependence on Russian gas, and Russia's threatened to cut them off. Was going to have to revert to coal. So coal is of course the worst of all. And similarly, China is building, something somewhere in the order of 2 coal plants a week, while we're not able to export our resources to help the world's environment. If we were actually to export our LNG to India, which we could actually reduce India's dependence on coal to the extent that it's 3 times the level of our own greenhouse gas emissions. So we have the ability to actually help the world's environment, and we're not doing that. But back to your question about whether this was overreach, that was our concern, and that's why we acted to try and close those loopholes.
I worry about these bad policies that block projects like the oil and gas cap and just the industrial carbon tax still, 69, C-48. I mean, the truth is, if climate is the real concern by a government that professes this, to me, these policies that they have are actually making our climate worse. And you just explained why.
Well, and we also are smart people. We have technology. Let's invest in clean tech. Um, and that was the problem with consumer carbon tax, and still with the industrial carbon tax, is it penalizes. It's a tax. It's a revenue scheme. It's not an environmental policy. It's not an investment in clean tech. I mean, nuclear is net zero. It powers 62% of Ontario's grid, and the Ontario government has made strides to, and the federal government needs to be a partner in that, in expanding on it. We have that expertise. Small modular reactors. There's all sorts of things we could be doing, which are, again, net zero in terms of energy. And so we have, again, that ability to help the world's environment, but with Canadian ingenuity, and it's time to seize that. And if I may add one other thing, just to your question overall about the intent, I think, and this is my opinion, it may not be correct, but I think part of what we saw with the introduction of, the small tax cut, which we now know is less than $200 a year for the average family, the other legislation that they quickly introduced in the first month of their government, including Bill C-5, absent a budget, which is a real plan, it's a little bit like, in my opinion, window dressing. It's like, okay, look over, yes, we want free trade in Canada by Canada. We want to build major projects. We want tax cuts because we want to address affordability, because it's clearly a massive issue for Canadians. So we'll throw this legislation out and we'll do this. And was that rushed through? Was there a lot of thought behind it? And that's why we had to make quite a number of amendments to C-5, for example.
Well, thank you to you and your wonderful, not your, but the wonderful committee that did so much work and kept us in parliamentary procedure. But I do have one further question, and then we'll move on to something else. We're not getting a budget, but people in their homes are trying to live within the means and can't even put a budget together. And if we didn't have these ridiculous restrictions on our natural resources, our ability to work, to provide for the world, to use our technology to stop some of these things that stop our country from moving forward, wouldn't people have a lot more money in their pockets? Wouldn't we maybe even be able to get a budget because we'd have something good to look at? I just think it's ridiculous that our country's being held in abeyance while people suffer.
And that was the entire thrust of our campaign. That was certainly the reason that I left my private sector career to run for politics, and others did, and everyone does so with good intention, because Canada should be booming. We should be prospering. We have everything the world wants, and we're being held back by bad government policies. The OECD, which is the top 40 some odd industrialized countries of the world, the OECD organization did a report about 4 years ago. It showed that Canada had the lowest private sector investment in our economy of any country in the OECD. So we were worse than Italy, than Greece, than some other countries that have historically been poor performers, because our taxes are too high, the regulatory system and red tape are not predictable, so business is not investing. So we've got it all, but we're not getting that activity in our economy. And what that means is, in terms of affordability, people trying to make ends meet. I mean, taxes could be so much lower because our economy would be prospering. As well, people would have bigger paychecks, better paying jobs. I mean, we need welders, pipe fitters. You want to talk about in my hometown of the Hamilton area, steel. Well, do you know how much steel goes into pipelines and LNG facilities? Those are jobs, great paying jobs. Those are good jobs, and we have that ability to make our country prosper. And yet the Liberal government over the course of the last decade has said no to all these these projects that would have built us up and given us those powerful paychecks. So it isn't a matter of, we'll see in the budget where there's obviously excess that needs to be trimmed. They've increased in the recent spending estimates the amount given to consultants, $26 billion. That's $1,400 per household. That's ridiculous. But we can also grow the pie, grow the economy, have people working in better paying jobs, and reduce our reliance on the United States in terms of a trading partner, and help the world. So that's why I'm so optimistic about Canada as we think about Canada today. We have it all. We have great people. We are the best country in the world. We have people seek to come to Canada. They've sought to come to Canada for generations and generations. And we now need to make sure that that promise of Canada is restored and that pride in Canada is restored so that we can see that for our children and grandchildren.
And I think that brings us, and thank you, Dan, to really what's happened lately in our country. Look, we recently had an election. The Liberals were given a minority government. It was clearly a legitimate election. But I get calls from people, Dan, and they ask me, what's the next steps with the Conservative Party finding a leader? How is it going to work for Mr. Poilievre, who will be running in a by-election? Can you help people understand just what's the process for the by-election and how the Conservatives will end up with a leader?
Right. And so let me just say right off the top that, in the last election, while we didn't form the government, we increased our seat count. We got a higher percentage of the vote in any election since 1988. In fact, no prime minister since Brian Mulroney in 1988 has had greater than 43%. So this was an unusual election in that perspective. So we grew. We had over 8 million people that put their trust and faith and hope in us. And they did so because they saw in Pierre Poilievre someone who had a vision for what I've talked about, to restore Canada's promise, to unleash our potential, to unleash a generational boom in our economy with shovel-ready zones and a national energy corridor and one-and-done approvals and reducing taxes, bringing about affordability, a real plan to actually build houses and bring about housing affordability. And, they saw in him a leader. And young people in particular were enthusiastic. I mean, we won as Conservatives the student vote for the first time in my lifetime. And young people were very excited. They were volunteering on campaigns when they knocked on doors. Young people, people who had come from other countries to move to Canada and said, this isn't the country I came to 10 or 15 years ago, and it can be so much more. And so they put their faith and trust in us and because it's and in Pierre Poilievre. So I firmly believe that he will be an outstanding prime minister, and we're building towards the next election, which I don't think is going to be 4 years from now. It's probably going to be 18 to 24 months from now, which is the typical minority government. So in terms of the by-election, you asked about that. So Pierre Poilievre is seeking a seat in Battle River Crowfoot, which is a riding in East Central Alberta. And so, to his credit, Prime Minister Carney has said he would call the by-election at the earliest possible moment so that Pierre can get a seat in Parliament. So that's probably going to be a by-election in August, which means that when Parliament resumes in September, Pierre Poilievre will be back in Parliament and we'll be building towards the next election. The process for a by-election is that the existing MP in that riding, who very graciously gave up his seat for Pierre Poilievre, Damien Kirk, he's not, you can't resign as an MP until 30 days after you're sworn in. So he just resigned officially last week. That resignation letter went to the Speaker within the earliest day that the Prime Minister can call a by-election after the Speaker declares a vacancy in a riding is 11 days after. So that will be sometime around Canada Day, if my math is correct, that a by-election date can be announced. In Canada, election and by-election dates are Mondays, and it has to be a minimum of 36-day campaign, up to a 56-day campaign. So if you started to add all that up, it could be one of the Mondays in August, August 11th, 18th, that sort of timing. If it happens to be, because the first Monday in August is the civic holiday, as we know, when it's a statutory holiday, it moves to the Tuesday. So it could be Tuesday, August 5th. But we're looking at an August by-election, and Pierre is out there campaigning and listening, working to earn the trust of the people of East Central Alberta so he can represent them in Parliament, back on the stage representing all of Canadians who are looking for hope and looking for change.
Wonderful. And I want to make an editorial comment by myself. Again, it's not yours, Dan. There was a strong sense in the last election that a lot of baby boomers did not vote for Pierre and didn't care for supposedly his way of doing business. And not everybody has to jump into it the way I did. I'm a boomer, 1954, born. Now I'm 71. You don't have to take a job with your MP to find things out. But I'm going to tell you that you should volunteer. In fact, it doesn't matter the party or the candidate, but Canadians have to get involved. We need educated decisions. We need educated voters in this country. It's too late, ladies and gentlemen, to let the other people make the decision. I'm going to make one small comment, and that is simply I had the privilege many times of talking with Mr. Poilievre. I had some duties, thanks to Dan, that I got to take part in some of the meetings that he held, and nobody worked harder than Pierre. Dan was pretty close. I got to tell you, Dan was pretty close. But I have to say, ladies and gentlemen, if you would just listen to him, if you would take the time to hear the story of this man who walks, talks, and believes in Canada and doesn't believe in people struggling and food banks and people being taxed for no reason, that does nothing for climate. I'm getting fired up now. But you have to listen to me, ladies and gentlemen. I've talked to him. He's a real man. And he's also the father of a child who has some challenges. And he deals with that. And he has a great wife. And it's a great family. And his story is amazing. So please pay attention.
I think you hit the nail on the head. And Pierre Poilievre is the real deal. He was adopted at a young age from two school teachers in Alberta. His wife is a refugee from Venezuela who grew up in a apartment in East End of Montreal. I mean, they have lived the very average middle-class Canadian life, and so they understand. And and he very much empathizes with people and connects with people and resonates with people. When he talks to them one-on-one, you see that. And so that's why I'm very optimistic about the future and the great things that are to be accomplished.
Our parliamentary system, which we've been talking about during this almost 1 hour, is an adversarial process many times. People do work together on committees. Dan talked about that. But the truth is it's adversarial, and the job of the opposition is to hold the government's feet to the fire to make sure that our country works. Pierre Poilievre did his job. He represented Canadians and our needs by being the best opposition leader that he could be with his great opposition team. Please remember that. Don't judge the man by what you see in question period and what the media is telling you. Look at what the opposition is supposed to be doing. Are they doing it? And is the government doing what they're supposed to be doing? Well, Dan, we want to thank you very much for coming on today. What a way to have the Canada Day weekend. And ladies and gentlemen, as I said, our MPs, our senators, the staff, they are working for our country. When you see one, you meet one, or if you get a chance to volunteer for one, do it. Dan, thanks so much for coming on to the Your Grey Matters podcast. We are really honored to have you on the show today.
Thank you, Neil. It's been a pleasure, and happy Canada Day to everyone. Let's celebrate the best country on earth.
And ladies and gentlemen, please like and subscribe our podcast. You will find lots of cool notes with this episode, as always, and we will see you again on the next Your Gray Matters podcast. Click right here. Tell a friend. Send us comments. Thanks a lot.